Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and what we're going to be looking at today is the issue of restorative justice and its relationship to goals, objectives, and outcomes related to reparations. We're also going to be looking at crucial questions that people need to start asking themselves and others when discussing reparations, whether we're talking about private discussions or more public discussions in mediated spaces. And we're going to wrap up the discussion with a look at some of the keynotes related to Japanese reparations and that process. So we're going to address some of the myths and miseducation related to that and how that relates to American descendants of slavery situations. And as always, if this appears on anything other than the Dr. Tracey McCarthy channel, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. And let's just quickly recap reparations. And basically, reparations is just making amends for a wrong or an injury. That's it. It's really that simple. One thing individuals need to keep in mind is this idea of limiting representation. And so representation is where someone speaks for you, or they speak on your behalf, or they stand in your shoes. And so you want to be careful about having too much of that going on. And so one of the things you want to think about when individuals are speaking for you, you want to make sure that the person is an actual advocate for restorative justice. You don't want individuals who have competing interests. And so you want to have a limitation on individuals who have identities that may be inconsistent with the identity of American descendant of slavery. And so when you really start to get down to it, you really want to have individuals trace their ancestry to make sure that you don't have someone representing you who is a descendant, for instance, of an enslaver. So you want to be very careful about that. One of the reasons why American Indians lost a lot of land and resources is because they had individuals speaking for them who really should not have been speaking for them. So some people had voices that really should not have had those voices. And so things did not work out very well because of that. And in terms of enslavers, it doesn't matter the skin color or phenotype of the enslaver. So in certain parts of America, you had individuals who were enslavers that might have been more brown, and some of them may have been lighter. So it varies. So you just can't look at someone's skin color and make a determination based upon that, because many people with brown skin did have enslaved individuals, and some people who had lighter skin did not have enslaved individuals. So you want to just be very cautious about who is representing you, who is speaking for you, and limit the extent to which people are speaking for you. It's one of the reasons why it's important for individuals, if they are able to do so, to actually attend Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, to actually go to the conference in DC. It's a few days. It's a monumental experience. You'll definitely get to interact with legislators and community leaders, not just from America, but often from other parts of the world. So it's a very important dynamic to participate in, particularly in this particular political climate. And so you'll get to attend what are known as brain trusts and all sorts of workshops and seminars, and undoubtedly they are going to be addressing reparations at this particular conference. Now, along with the issue of representation is this emerging issue with confounds. And so there are a number of individuals very vocal in terms of social media that have different identities. So you may have skin folk who are not kinfolk. And so you want to be very careful about allowing, again, other people to speak for you, because you do have this sort of confounding variable operating right now. And so in that way, social media has been very helpful, so that you know those voices are actually there, because you might not have known 2 years ago, you might not have known that these individuals, they may look like you, but they have interests that are competing against your interests. Now, earlier on when we would discuss these issues, I would confound, or sort of merge the issues of ADOS and American Indians, because the histories are highly integrated. Now, for some individuals, they may not have an idea that it's integrated, but when you're talking about places such as Louisiana, for instance, you have a very creolized dynamic going on, and you'll have individuals who are saying, there were no Africans brought over, but in Louisiana there were definitely Africans brought over, and people in Louisiana are definitely mixed with a variety of ancestry. And so let's just quickly think about this idea of confounds. And so a confound, or when you're confounding something, things get mixed up, they get poured together, they get muddled, and so things become very confusing, and you will end up with outcomes that you did not anticipate. So your efforts will perhaps be frustrated because of the confound, and the confounds are other individuals. So again, you just need to be very clear about who is representing you, who is speaking on your behalf. There are a number of individuals, because this conversation has been so public and on social media, everyone feels like they can sort of throw their hat in the ring in terms of the discussion and also sort of representing people. But if an individual does not identify as a descendant of American slavery, then they are not representing you. And so you just need to be confident that the people who are speaking for you are actually you. Now, there are two issues that people should consider when discussing reparations, and they're asking questions of people related to reparations. And those two issues have to do with vantage point and vocation. And so once you understand a person's vantage point, it helps you to understand where they are coming from, and it also helps you to determine what types of questions you might want to ask of that individual. And so you can find this out sometimes by understanding their academic background. You can understand better how they view the world based upon their academic discipline. So if a person has a background in law, their degree is in law, they are going to see the world in a particular way versus a person who has a background in political science, or a degree in theology, or a degree in history, or no degree at all. Okay, so a lot of this is going to tell you something about the way that the person is perceiving and understanding and operating in the world. You might want to ask questions about their vocation. Are they community leaders? Is this person a legislator? Are they running for president? Is it a presidential candidate? Is the person a victim of harm? So are you talking to someone who is a victim of Jim Crow, or a descendant of someone who was a victim of slavery? Or are you talking to someone who was a perpetrator of Jim Crow, or descended from someone who was an enslaver? And in some instances, you might be talking to someone who, or questioning someone who has both a background as a descendant of someone who was victimized by slavery, or someone who was a perpetrator of slavery. And then some instances will involve individuals who have no standing whatsoever. So they have really no relationship to any of this. And so that will also help you to determine the types of questions that you might want to ask, or the type of engagement you want to or should be having with those individuals. Now let's turn our attention to the issue of goals, objectives, and outcome measures. One of the things that people need to understand is the importance of establishing goals, because goals will determine the discussion that you have with people. It will also determine the actions that you will take. And so one of the things that is missing from the larger discussion is the dynamic of understanding the actual overarching goal and what are the objectives that are going to be used in achievement of the goal, and then what are the outcome measures. And so let's just look at what goal is. In terms of reparation, there needs to be a general statement of the overall purpose regarding reparations. What is the overarching goal? Then there needs to be a statement regarding the objectives. What are going to be the concrete methods of goal achievement? And then third, there needs to be a discussion about outcome measures. And outcome measures are just basically the expected results from goal achievement for reparation. It needs to be operationalized. And so people need to understand, what does reparation or restoration actually look like in reality? What does it look like to be repaired? What does that look like in action? And how do you measure success in terms of being repaired? In terms of this reparation, how do you measure success? And by success, we're not talking about success in life. We're talking about success in terms of the goal of reparation. And so what does that success look like? What does a successful goal look like? Now we're going to address some crucial questions related to restorative justice. One of the things that happens with discussions related to reparations or restorative justice or law or justice period is that people are often not on the same page. And in this instance, what happens is people just jump to the question of, do you believe in reparations or do you support reparations? And then they get a response. And often the individual asking the question and the person answering the question, they may not be on the same page regarding even the definition of reparations or restorative justice. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a series of questions that are categorized that you might think about asking people related to reparations without asking them directly, do they support reparations? Actually, the answers to a number of these questions will give you a really good idea about how the person understands justice and how they understand law and how they understand equity. This will inform your understanding of what they think about how the world operates and how people operate, and it'll give you some insight into whether or not they really believe in reparations and restorative justice or not. Okay, so before you get to any really deep questions about reparations or restorative justice, one of the things that you want to understand is the person's understanding of law. And so there are 4 questions that you might want to ask the person before getting to the direct question of their understanding or their beliefs regarding restorative justice or reparations. And so one question is very simple, asking them, what is the purpose of law? What is their understanding of justice? What is their understanding of the construct of natural law? And then as it ties to other situations where restorative justice has taken place, reparations have been provided, a question you might ask is their understanding of the legal construct of precedent. In addition to questions related to law, it's important to get an understanding of the person's perspective related to equity, because a large part of reparation is about equity. And so you might want to think about asking them questions such as, what is their understanding of the construct of equity? What is the purpose of equity for them? You might, when you start talking about slavery, if you want to tie that together, you can ask them questions about equity and slavery without asking them questions about, do they believe in reparations? And so some other questions you might ask for them to think about are, under what legal or equitable construct was reparation provided to former chattel enslavers? Another question is, what did the reparation provided the enslavers indicate regarding the economic value of the free slave labor? And finally, a question might be, when you're looking at the situation of the enslavers and the enslaved, which of those groups had the higher legal or moral right to reparations? Some other questions that you might think about asking individuals related to reparations indirectly. You might want to ask questions about their understanding of the Constitution, their understanding of doctrine related to the Constitution and the functioning of the government. And so you might want to ask them just very directly, what is the purpose of government? What's their understanding of that? Do they believe in and support the United States Constitution? Do they understand what the Equal Protection Clause is? So you can ask them, what is the Equal Protection Clause? And then related to Jim Crow and slavery and reparations, a question might be, did Jim Crow violate equal protection? Did it violate that clause in any way? And then related to the social contract in terms of the federal government. In terms of the state government also, what is the United States social contract? And in understanding that social contract, what is the legal doctrine of parens patriae? Now you can ask any of these questions and then tie it back to questions related to reparations. And so, for instance, you might ask whether slavery and not protecting people from slavery or not providing reparations earlier, did that violate this doctrine of parens patriae? And for those who are not familiar, parens patriae is father of the country. So it's that protective proclivity that the government is supposed to have in relation to its children, its citizens, its residents. And before getting to questions related to reparations, you might want to ask some questions about the person's position on crime. And so the way that a person views crime will tell you a lot about how they understand reparations or restorative justice. And so you can start off with questions such as, why do they believe criminal laws exist? What's the legal construct of theft? Are criminal contracts that involve criminal subject matter, such as slavery, are they legally enforceable? How does restorative justice relate to crime commission? And then another important construct for you to ask is about mala in se and mala prohibita. Asking them to contrast those two things, that's an important thing. And so once they contrast that, if they are able to, you can then ask questions about how slavery and Jim Crow, particularly slavery, how it fits into those constructs. Does it fit in the mala in se category or does it not? And many people will offer that when slavery was taking place, that it was legal. And so the question about mala in se is a great follow-up for that, or a great lead-in, because mala in se basically talks about crimes being wrong in and of themselves. They are inherently wrong. And next, you might want to touch on issues of accountability. And so some of the questions you might want to ask before getting to discussions on reparations directly is you might want to ask things like, what is the legal construct of damages? Or what is the legal construct of restitution or unjust enrichment? What is the person's understanding of the legal construct of constructive trust? What is the legal construct of tracing? How do they understand those things? And then you might want to follow that up with, then how do damages, restitution, unjust enrichment, tracing, and constructive trust, how do those relate to slavery and Jim Crow? It's also important to understand the person's position on human rights, and it's also important to understand if they understand the differences between human rights, civil rights, and social justice. Oftentimes people conflate those three, and you need to make sure that the person you are talking to understands that there are distinctions. And so an easy way to do that is to simply ask them to contrast human rights, civil rights, and social justice, so that you understand that they understand that there is a distinction. And with respect to reparations, you were really talking about human rights issues. And then to a lesser extent, you're talking about civil rights. Additionally, you want to ask them whether they understand slavery as a human rights violation. Is slavery mala in se? Again, you can ask that question very directly. Is slavery moral? Is another question that you want to ask, because this is going to give you some idea about the person's moral compass also. So you want to also ask questions about the relationship between human trafficking, human rights, and natural law. What's their understanding of that relationship? And then a multi-part question is the question of, were any principles of justice violated in the context of U.S. slavery? And if there were some principles of justice violated, what were those principles? You can ask them that directly. What were the principles of justice that were violated? If they say no, then you can ask for an explanation. And then next, you want to make sure that they have the knowledge base that you believe they should have related to reparations and restorative justice. And so one question, a foundational question, would be, what is the legal construct of reparations? And so this gets to the question of, do they understand what reparations is? Or are they on the same page that you are related to reparations? And this will reveal that for you. You might want to ask them, what is the legal construct of restorative justice? Some other questions that are related, which require a little bit of analysis on their part, is, why did the United Nations indicate a belief in the need for reparations for people who are identified as Negro, foundational Black Americans, African Americans? You might want to also ask them, and this gets at whether or not they've even looked at this, what types of restoration indicated by the United Nations do they believe serve as appropriate redress for slavery and Jim Crow, or slavery or Jim Crow? And finally, what you want to get at is, how does restorative justice differ from a handout or social welfare? This is important because many people will frame reparations as social welfare or a handout. And so you want to make sure that they understand the difference and that they can articulate that, regardless of whether they believe it or not, that they can actually articulate an understanding of the distinctions. Now, because the questions relate to law, ethics, morality, justice, ethics, you also want to incorporate, for those who think best in this way, you want to also include questions related to biblical admonition related to reparations. So one question that you might ask an individual, let's say you're talking to clergy, a question you might ask is, on a societal level, how do you interpret Proverbs 14:9? And you can ask, fools mock at making amends for sin, but goodwill is found among the upright, in terms of scripture. And so that's a question that you might want to ask someone who has that type of background. A lot of discussion revolves around HR 40. And so one of the things that you want to get an understanding of is the person's knowledge of HR 40. And so you can start off with something very basic. And something basic would be, what is the thesis of HR 40? And so they should be able to tell you what the main umbrella is for HR 40. You might want to ask them, why was HR 40 proposed in the first place? What are the main points of HR 40? And this will get to whether or not they have really read and understood HR 40. Then you might ask them, on which points do they agree in terms of those main points? Do they agree with any of the main points? And then on which points do they disagree? Do they disagree with any of the main points? And this will get you to a point of understanding how they are understanding reparations, how they're understanding HR 40, and what they think should and should not be done in relation to slavery and Jim Crow. And then you can just give them an open-ended question. What is your analysis of HR 40? And so that allows them to freely talk about and explore their understanding of HR 40. And once you are able to assess the person's basic understanding of HR 40 and reparations, you can ask more detailed questions. And here's a list of questions that you might want to consider. One is, what aspects of law and equity should be considered when examining slavery and Jim Crow? Now, these are a little deeper than the other questions, but this is going to really get to the heart of the person's understanding and feelings about reparations. And so a follow-up question could be, in the United States, is there a precedent for reparations or restorative justice based upon any human rights violations? You might want to ask, under what legal construct has restorative justice ever been afforded a demographic class in America? Another question is, what types of resources were afforded by law and policy to those identified as white during Jim Crow? And conversely, what types of resources were denied by law and policy to those identified as Black/Negro during Jim Crow? And finally, you might want to ask a question related to rectifying those imbalances. And so what would it take to rectify the imbalances of the prior resource denials and allocations during Jim Crow? So what would it take to rectify that imbalance in current times? Okay, so now that we've covered a few questions that you might want to consider asking and exploring in your discussions related to reparations, we're going to look at some keynotes related to Japanese reparations. This is important because there is a lot of misinformation, miseducation, myths out there related to reparations for other groups. And so some people believe that the Japanese internment took place, and then almost the next day or the next year after it ended, reparations was just granted, and it didn't exactly work that way. And so I just want to call your attention to some of these dates, and also to normalize some part of the process that people are seeing right now, because some people are put off by the idea of a study commission. But a study commission also took place in terms of Japanese reparations. And so what started off in terms of the internment, that was in 1942, and there was not a commission to study reparations until 1980. And then after that, it took until 1988 to start the reparative justice process. And that plus is there because the reparation process didn't just happen in a very neat fashion. It continued on after 1988. And so saying all this to say that a commission to study reparations, that is a normal part of the process. But again, referring back to the dynamic of a truth commission, we still stand on the belief in a need for a truth commission in this process. So before there is reparation, there needs to be a truth study. And this is just a little synopsis related to Japanese reparations. And so it gives you a little synopsis of who was involved, who sponsored this particular bill, who supported it, who actually received the reparations, and why. And as with the discussion related to American descendants of the institution of slavery, you have the restrictions on the reparations. And so the restrictions were for American citizens or legal permanent residents, and those who were ethnic Japanese but who had been taken from their homes in Latin America, such as Peru, they were not covered in reparations. And this is regardless of whether they remained in the United States or they returned to Latin America. Okay, this is our final discussion, and we are concluding our final discussion on ancestry, legacy, history, and ADOS and restorative justice. But we're going to end with some food for thought, and these are some questions for you to entertain for yourself and for you to reflect upon when you are thinking about going forward, not just related to restorative justice, but just in life, period. And so these will be a few questions for you to think about related to ADOS and restorative justice and how you are interacting with people around this issue. Now, it's understandable that people want to have broad-based discussions, but people need to start asking themselves, what is the merit of some of the discussions and the debates? And, asking, do these debates serve as a liability or an asset in terms of whatever direction you are going in? For one, people might want to consider whether the conversations on the internet are serving a good end. Now, of course, many of the conversations are extremely beneficial, but at some point you have to figure out whether this is the place to process everything and to explore everything. And so these are just some things to consider, even when you're talking about these debates and discussions that are taking place on Capitol Hill. Those sometimes need to be rethought. And another thing to consider is, when you have a plan or a dream in life, is the internet the place that you take that dream to discuss and process? There are all sorts of people on the internet. You don't know everyone. Many people are, not real. Some of them are actually trolls. You've got bots going on. You've got all sorts of things going on. And so just in life, period, you need to ask why you are discussing certain things in this particular forum. It's just like thinking about, if you have a dream, discussing something with a dream slayer. And so here are some questions for you to think about. Is CARICOM on the internet debating its issues with you as ADOS? Is the African Immigrant Caucus on the internet discussing its issues with you? Are any of the Native American or Indian councils on the internet discussing Native American Indian issues with you? Or basically, are there any other groups other than ADOS on the internet processing their issues with all comers and takers? And so another thing to think about is, for instance, if you have a dream, why would you discuss it with dream slayers, people who are not going to support your dream? If you have a plan in life, why would you discuss it with people who are serving as distractors and detractors? And if you are committed to anything, why would you keep company with those who are just lukewarm? If you have a goal, why would you pursue it with those who have opposing goals? If you are looking towards success, why would you keep company with and engage those who are more focused on failure? That phrase, mute the noise, is a very good one. And so you can ask yourself, when these debates come up, what is your motivation for engaging the derailment, the distraction, the non-committal, the opposing goals, the focusing on failure regarding reparations versus focusing on the potential for success? What will happen if you continue to focus on individuals who find fault with everything? They offer that HR 40 will never materialize, restoration will never happen, and you have individuals who are focused on anything and everything but forward movement and positivity. So you might want to keep these things in mind anytime you are having a discussion related to restorative justice. Now, this is one of the more important discussions related to reparations in terms of all of the discussions that we have had. And so what we've covered is reparation, the need to limit representation, the understanding of vantage point and vocation and how important that is in these discussions. And so you know that what's more important than simply asking someone, do they believe in reparations, is to get to that vantage point. You want to understand where they are coming from and how they are thinking about issues related to law, morality, ethics, justice, and human rights. And when you get those answers, it's going to tell you what a person should be thinking about reparations. And then you can use that as a foundation for discussions about reparations. Another thing that we discussed, we talked about self-reflection. Another thing that's really important is that individuals are starting to work offline, and individuals are gathering and having conversations out of the social media space. Social media is convenient in terms of having that initial online dialogue, but again, it serves as a roadblock to effectively processing and doing real work. And so it's hard to do real work online, and you all need to start doing real work. And so the being offline and meeting offline and engaging offline is very important. And that's why, again, it's very important for individuals who are able to attend Congressional Black Caucus in September. It's a few days. You can actually go for one day or a few days. You don't have to stay the whole time. You can, as the schedule comes out, you can look to see what is going to be going on each day, and you can plan accordingly. And again, it's important to have relevant voices at Congressional Black Caucus, and you get to direct your communications to the actual legislators. You get to have communications with national and local leaders and community builders and members of the National Bar Association. So it's a very good space to be in, to get a sense of what's going on and what other people are saying about reparations. You get to hear it firsthand and not online. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.